Hello friends, welcome to the second lecture of Economic Survey of India. Here we will be discussing the chapter, does growth lead to debt sustainability? Yes, but not vice versa. So forget it, forget the name. In this chapter, the discussion is on what kind of fiscal policy should India go for in order to ensure that we have a sustainable growth. Now, all of us must be knowing what fiscal policy is. Fiscal policy basically is the way government spends its money to manage various factors of macroeconomics. So, to ensure sustainable growth, how the government would spend money to ensure other aspects of economics, how other aspects of other parameters of macroeconomics, how government would be spending money. That is decided in the fiscal policy. Monetary policy is decided by RBI. So यहाँ पे we are talking about fiscal policy. What kind of fiscal policy should India have to ensure sustainable growth, considering that we are going through a recession? There have been two quarters where India's GDP growth was negative. This is the definition of recession. So considering that we are going through technical recession, what kind of economic policy should we have? Generally, it is said that we should go for expansionary economic policy, or at the time of recession, we should go for counter-cyclic economic policy. Now, in counter-cyclic economic policy, we'll study counter-cyclic economic policy in more detail. But in counter-cyclic economic policy, what we do is, when the economy is going through recession, we have to counter it by government spending a lot of money. So now, in the COVID-19 situation, we are saying that in counter-cyclic economic policy, government should spend a lot of money, but government's revenue were also impacted in COVID-19 situation. In that case, where would government get its money from? It will get its money from a lot of loans. So government's revenue is going down, government is borrowing a lot of money, debt will increase. And in future, we have to pay back these debts with interest. So when we are going for counter-cyclic economic policy or expansionary economic policy, then some concerns emerge. For example, there are concerns raised about things like whether it would impact future growth. Right now, by spending a lot of money, we are ensuring growth. Is it going to impact future growth? Because in future, we'll need to pay back this money. Will it ensure our debt sustainability? Will our debt become so high that it would become very difficult for us to serve that debt, to pay interest on it and to pay back that debt? Will it hamper our sovereign rating? Will it hamper our external sector? These kind of concerns emerge. And this chapter of Economic Survey of India is focusing on these concerns, especially the debt. Okay, now let us talk about the two types of economic policy. I just spoke about counter-cyclic economic policy. One is counter-cyclic economic policy, other is pro-cyclic economic policy. So in counter-cyclic economic policy, what do? We counter the cycle. The name itself says counter-cyclic. Countering the cycle means, let's say, with time, this is my GDP growth rate. GDP is increasing, GDP is decreasing. So this is roughly GDP growth rate follows a cycle. After 10 years or so, you will find a recessionary period, then increase, then decrease, it happens. So GDP growth rate follows a cycle. Economic growth rate follows a cycle. In counter-cyclic fiscal policy, government tries to counter this. When GDP is increasing a lot, you will take steps to prevent this overheating. So when GDP is increasing a lot, at that time, government will increase tax rates so that less money is with people, less money is in the private sector, वो growth rate थोड़ा सा reduce होगा. In the same way, government will reduce its expenses. It will reduce demand and growth थोड़ा सा hamper. So here, government will ensure that GDP will be, rather than something like this, it would be something like this. When growth rate is low, at that time, in counter-cyclic economic policy, when we are going through recession, in counter-cyclic economic policy, what will we do? We will reduce the tax rate. so that people will be left with more money to spend. We will increase the expenditure. Government will increase the expenditure. This is what happens in counter-cyclic economic policy. If you'll go here, this is something that has been mentioned here. In counter-cyclic economic policy, at the time of recession, expansionary fiscal policy would be followed. Government expenditure will go up. Government will reduce the taxes. Government is reducing the taxes, its expenses needs to go up. It will borrow more money to increase its expenditure, right? At the same time, at the time of when the economy is growing, in counter-cyclic economic policy, what will we do? We will reduce government expenditure. We will increase taxes, so that overheating that is occurring should reduce. So this counter-cyclical economic policy, it slows down the recession, it softens the recession and moderates the expansion. What did we do here? This was our economic growth. We softened it. We reduced the recession. We softened the recession. We reduced the growth rate here. In counter-cyclic economic policy, this is what we do. In pro-cyclic economic policy, what do we do? In pro-cyclic economic policy, we support the cycle. So when we are going through, this is our economic, the white one is our economic growth rate in normal circumstances. Here in pro-cyclic economic policy, we will support this growth further. The government will also spend money. The economy is already doing well, government will spend money, government will reduce taxes. Something which in counter-cyclic we were doing at the time of recession, that we will do it here at this rate. So here economic growth cycle would look something like this. This is pro-cyclic policy. Pro-cyclic. This is counter-cyclic. Okay, so generally all the studies have suggested that counter-cyclic economic policy is the one which ensures sustainable growth, which ensures more inclusive growth, and which is something that should be followed. You counter the cycle. You counter the normal economic cycle. Fine. Have you been able to understand the difference between pro-cyclic and counter-cyclic? Okay. Now, let's understand how counter-cyclical fiscal policy contributes. How does it work? One thing is clear. So, you know that GDP can be calculated in a number of ways. One is the expenditure method, where GDP could be presented like this, where C is the consumption by the private sector, consumption by the individuals, households, I is the investment, G is the government expenditure, X is export, M is imports. Now, at the time of recession, right now, in the current situation, what would be happening? Consumption is low. Not a lot of people are spending a lot of money. This is reduced, this is reducing, right? Like people who wanted to attend coaching institutes, they are not doing it. This is just an example, because incomes have gone down, they do not have money to pay, or they are saving for future because the future is not very clear. In the same way, investment also goes down, because investment would go down because in general GDP growth rate is less. So what if I invest something the business doesn't do well? If the GDP growth is good, people would invest more. So here in this situation, our overall GDP will be decreasing because of decrease in consumption, because of decrease in investment. See, this is a method of calculating GDP. So in this situation, if government expenditure, in counter-cyclical fiscal policy, what will we do? We'll increase government expenditure at the time of recession. So if we increase government expenditure, we can ensure that our GDP growth remains stable. और if we can increase government expenditure, एक तो consumption वाला, एक investment वाला. Investment will come from both private sector and government. So if we can increase government expenditure in consumption as well as in investment, it will overall in this formula you will be able to see would contribute to better economic growth. Now, this is only one aspect. That is, it cushions the contraction in output by contributing to the GDP growth. This is one way in which counter-cyclical economic policy contributes. But there are other reasons also that during recession, counter-cyclical economic policy is more effective. One is, at the time of recession, spending multiplier is higher. Now, what is meant by spending multiplier being higher? When government will spend 1 rupee, in normal circumstances, let's say at the time when growth rate is very high, this 1 rupee may result in overall GDP contribution of 1.5 rupee. That is, let's say when we are constructing roads, uske aur bhi fayde honge. Overall in GDP, its contribution would be much higher. But at the time of recession, when we are adding 1 rupee to the economy, its spending multiplier is higher. That is, this 1 rupee would be contributing more than 1.5 rupees. We'll understand why this would happen. In the next topic, we are talking about why the spending multiplier is higher. But for now, understand what is meant by spending multiplier. The overall contribution in the GDP of investment of 1 rupee would be higher at the time of recession. This also becomes a factor because of which in counter-cyclic economic policy, by counter-cyclic economic policy, government contributes, increases, prevents GDP deceleration, increase GDP growth. Now, higher spending by government also compensates for risk aversion by private players. Now, private sector is not investing a lot because of risk, they are staying away from the market. So, this is compensated by government expenditure. Economy remains better. Then, it also enhances expectation multiplier. Now, what is expectation multiplier? Understand it in this way. See, I'm a private player who wants to invest in the Indian economy. At the time of recession, I see, government is coming and helping to ensure that the GDP growth remains sustainable. So, I will expect that in future also GDP growth will remain sustainable because government will come and pitch in. But if I was following pro-cyclic economic policy, where at the time of recession government will also not spend, in that case the fluctuation in GDP growth rate would have been a lot. A private player would have been worried, if in future this would happen again, I will again suffer. But in a counter-cyclic economic policy, a private investor expects that if things go bad in future, government will be there to help. If recession occurs, government by counter-cyclic economic policy will reduce the impact of the recession. So this is another way by which we will promote private players to contribute and thus improve economic growth. समझ में आ रही है बात? तो not only is spending multiplier higher, but expectation multiplier is also higher by building confidence in tough times. Then this is something that's not only theoretical, this is something that has also been proved by several studies, both theoretically as well as empirically. Empirically, like based on data, based on previous data, this has been shown that yes, these positive results come. Now, in Economic Survey of India, they have named a number of research papers where these things have been proven. But for your examination, that's not important. In your economy paper, you do not write this research paper says this research paper says this research paper says this. That's not important. For you, what is important is the things that we are talking about. Counter-cyclic economic policy has been proved both theoretically as well as empirically. Now, there's a Ozkan and McManus, they did this study on 114 countries between 1950 and 2010, and they have also found that counter-cyclical fiscal policy stance with policy action against the cycle acts as a stabilizer. It stabilizes the economic growth by reducing output volatility and keeping growth on steady path. This is something that we have been talking about. For India too, when private consumption contributes almost 54% to our GDP, private investment contributes to 29% of our GDP. When these things are, private consumption is going down, private investment is uncertain. In this situation, government's contribution is important. So we should be going for counter-cyclic economic policy. Government's investment in the economy has to increase to deal with the problems that COVID-19 crisis has brought. Fine. Now, let's go to another small topic. Why? So, Economic Survey of India has so far recommended that we must be going for counter-cyclic economic policy. Fine. While talking about advantages of counter-cyclic economic policy, we said that the fiscal multiplier during economic slowdown is higher. Spending multiplier is higher. That is, when government will spend some money at the time of recession, the contribution would be higher when compared to when they are spending that money at the time of growth, high growth. So when should government be spending the money? When the multiplier is higher. Because when it will be spending at the time of high growth, the impact on economy would not be that much. So why? Why is that so? Why at the time of recession, multiplier, spending multiplier or fiscal multiplier is higher? This was one of the advantages we spoke about counter-cyclic economic policy. But why this is higher? Let's understand this. See, one is at this time, households or private sectors are bound by liquidity constraints. What is meant by they are bound by liquidity constraint? At the time of low economic growth, people lack money, sometimes even for basic things. खाने के लिए पैसा नहीं है, बच्चों की स्कूल के लिए पैसा नहीं है. Right? In this situation, if you ensure more money in their hands, what happens? They spend this money in consumption. Because their basic needs need to be fulfilled. Whereas when they have a lot of money, and at that time when you give them money, they may not actually spend it. They may not actually use that money to increase the aggregate demand. But at the time of recession, when they are bound by liquidity constraint, when the liquidity that they have is less and they get more money, what would they do? They would invest more. A business, suppose I'm running this institution and due to recession, I'm bound by liquidity constraint. It may happen. It may happen that Levelup IAS may get bound by liquidity constraint in future. At that time when I'll have more money because government has reduced the taxes, what will I do with that money? I will consume it. I'll spend it because liquidity is something that was hindering me. So, but in normal circumstances, if government had reduced taxes and I had more money, what would I do with that money? I would have kept it with me. So, uska direct consumption may not have happened. But at the time of recession, any money that I get will add to the aggregate demand of the economy. So at the time of recession, this is better. At the time of recession, government expenditure would be better because it will lead to better fiscal multiplier. This is one reason. There are other reasons also. It will government expansionary policy at the time of recession will decrease the spread between bank deposit rate and bank loan rate. Let me explain this. Suppose right now when you go to ICICI Bank, you deposit money, you'll get interest rate of 5%. When you're taking loan, you're getting loan at an interest rate of 8%. Suppose this is the scenario. This is the scenario. Now when government puts more money in the market, what would happen? The ICICI would want investors should take more money from me. It will reduce its interest rate to 7%. So basically the spread between the deposit and the loan rate will reduce. When this reduces, then people generally do not want to, when this difference is very less, people generally do not want to keep their money in banks. They would say, itna interest rate come hai, I'll take loan and I'll invest. Interest rate is this less. And that is something which is being discussed here. It will lead to more borrowing and thus more spending. This more spending will expand the economy, which will further lead to decrease in spread further down, which will further increase borrowing, which will further, this cycle will repeat, which will be good for economy. Why fiscal multiplier is higher at the time of recession? Then there's a concern which is raised sometimes. If government is spending a lot of money in the economy, then private player who wanted to invest will be crowded out. because jahan pe investment ki zarurat thi, government has spent it. A concern like this is raised generally, but here we say at the time of recession this is unlikely to happen, because at the time of recession private player is not investing. So government expenditure is not crowding out anyone. At the time of normal economic cycle, when the economic growth rate was high, there if government also started increasing its expenditure, private sector is also increasing its expenditure, government is increasing its investment, private sector is increasing its investment, government's investment will crowd out private sector's investment. But right now this would not happen. So at the time of recession, this investment will have more value, higher multiplier effect, higher fiscal multiplier effect. Then finally, when government will invest more, it will create more public employment, more government jobs, right? This would happen. Now this also follows the in normal circumstances it is said that, oh, if government will give more jobs, then private players will find it difficult to hire people. There will be a tightening, increase in tightness, and therefore increase in tightness in employment, and therefore it may crowd out private employment. But again, because in this situation where recession is going on, unemployment is high, government's creation of employment will actually benefit and will not crowd out. The increase in tightness and resulting crowding out will be small. Crowding out of the private employment will be small because private employments are lesser in number. So these were some factors which were because of easing of financial constraint, which led to higher fiscal multiplier effect. Then there is another factor which will lead to higher fiscal multiplier effect at the time of recession, that is enhanced consumer sentiment for future productivity. वही बात वही है, if government is taking care of economic growth at the time of recession, consumer sentiments would be higher. When economic growth will increase, consumer would be more ready to spend money. See, during the first quarter, March to June, April, May, June, people were not spending anything. They didn't know what's going to happen. They were saving as much money as possible. This was also seen in the data which came, data about Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan accounts. In Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan accounts, in the first 2 quarters, the deposits increased because people were trying to save as much as possible. They were not spending money. They wanted to have a safe future. But as things improved, the average deposit in Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan account came down. So this confidence is built when at the time of recession, government contributes. Okay, so far what we have studied, one, the government needs to follow a counter-cyclic economic policy. And then counter-cyclic economic policy has some advantages, and how higher spending multiplier or how higher fiscal multiplier is possible at the time of recession, those we have seen. But now comes main part which this chapter of Economic Survey of India is discussing. If government will spend a lot of money right now, revenue is less, what will it have to do? It will have to borrow a lot of money. So our debt to GDP ratio will increase. Our debt to GDP ratio will increase. Will it create problems in future? Should we keep our debt very low so that our future economic growth would be better? If we increase our debt a lot, our future will have to pay interest on this debt rather than investing. There's this dilemma which occurs. There's this dilemma which comes. Right? Are you able to understand this dilemma? Should we keep the debt low or should we keep the debt high? How do we make our debt sustainable? How do we make our debt sustainable? Sustainable in the sense, something which we will be able to handle in future as well. Our debt to GDP ratio should not keep increasing. If it keeps increasing, sometimes debt becomes unsustainable when your total debt is more than your overall GDP. Then even when you pay everything from your GDP for that debt, you will not be able to pay back. So should we keep debt low right now, or should we go for higher debt and focus more on economic growth? These are some dilemmas which this chapter on Economic Survey of India is trying to resolve. So in general, if you go mathematically by the theory of debt dynamics, do not worry about this formula. Actually, if you are from economics background, you would understand this formula. If you are not from economics background, you do not have to worry about this formula. This formula basically came from debt this year will be equal to debt last year into interest rate, आपका revenue minus expenditure. In this way, you will basically calculate what is the debt this year. So basically, they're saying that your debt, difference in the debt, मतलब last year कितना debt to GDP ratio था, इस बार कितना debt to GDP ratio है. Delta DT is equal to RT, rate of interest minus growth rate into debt last year divided by 1 plus growth rate this year minus the primary deficit. This is the formula which they are using. You do not have to worry about this formula. Simple एक चीज notice करो. If let's say you want to keep your debt to GDP ratio constant, last year जितना था अभी भी उतना रहे, तो delta dt will be 0. Debt to GDP ratio, dt is debt to GDP ratio this year, delta dt is debt to GDP ratio this year minus debt to GDP ratio last year. If you want to keep it constant, it should be 0. So they are saying that your primary balance to GDP in that year should be equal to RT minus GT by into DT minus 1. Okay, ये भी समझ में नहीं आ रहा, ignore it. I do not want to get into a lot of mathematics because I sometimes feel that students lose interest in the subject when we get into unnecessary mathematics. For those of you who will understand mathematics, you will understand these equations and would be able to come to the conclusion which I want to come. You will come to the conclusion that if growth rate is more than R, if the economy's growth rate is more than the interest rate, then your debt is sustainable. Your debt to GDP ratio is decreasing every year. If I'm coming to the conclusion by solving all those mathematical things which Economic Survey of India has done for mathematicians and economists and statisticians जो भी होते हैं. By solving all those things, you will come to this conclusion that if your growth rate is higher than the interest rate, your debt to GDP ratio will be reducing every year, will be sustainable. If your growth rate is higher than the interest at which government borrows the money, then your debt to GDP ratio will remain sustainable. If it's equal, all well and good. If it's higher, growth rate is higher than interest rate, then it will remain sustainable. Or, what the hell? You read more. Yeah. So I'm saying if your growth rate is higher, your debt is sustainable. Or if your interest rate growth differential, interest minus growth differential, IRGD बोल रहे हैं इसे हम, interest rate growth differential is negative. जब growth rate higher होगा तो IRGD will be negative. IRGD is basically R minus G. We are saying growth should be higher than interest rate. So if IRGD is negative, then your growth is sustainable and your debt would also be sustainable. Your debt is sustainable. So if your growth rate today is higher than the interest rate at which you are borrowing money, that doesn't matter how much money you are borrowing. Your debt is sustainable. Your debt will keep decreasing. This is what the conclusion. And now, if your IRGD is positive, that is if your interest rate is higher than growth rate, your growth rate is lesser, then debt is difficult to sustain. It will be harder and slower for government to sustain the debt, to ensure debt sustainability. So a negative IRGD, that is higher growth when compared to interest, is something that we need to have a sustainable debt. That is what we are worried about. In counter-cyclic economic policy, we want to invest a lot. Government wants to invest a lot. but for that they'll take a lot of debt. We also want that this debt should be sustainable. Abhi, by investing a lot, we should not ensure that in future we'll be in a lot of trouble. The debt should be sustainable. And we are saying that if our growth rate can be made better than the interest rate at which we are borrowing money, our debt could be sustainable. Over the last 2.5 decades, our GDP growth rate has been higher than our debt rate, our interest rate. And therefore, over the last 2.5 decades, our debt to GDP ratio has been decreasing. Thus, if growth is more than interest rate, just 5 more minutes, this booklet would be done. I have explained you the fundamental things. If growth is more than interest rate, then the fiscal cost of debt rollover reduces. आप अभी debt ले रहे हैं, उसको अगले बार में पे करना पड़ेगा, तो fiscal cost of debt rollover reduces. In fact, Blanchard in one of his presidential address to American Economic Association had said, if the interest rate paid by the government is less than the growth rate, then the intertemporal budget constraint facing the government no longer binds. That is, अभी आप पैसे ले रहे हो, बाद में उसे देना है. Intertemporal budget constraint will not impact the government. Conclusion is, make your growth rate better. Or you could have said, sir, instead of making growth rate better, you could reduce the interest rate. G should be more than R. You could reduce the interest rate. But we are talking about growth rate because over the last 2.5 decades, we have seen that change in IRGD, interest rate growth differential, has mostly been derived by growth, because it is the growth which is more fluctuating. Interest rate more or less same raha, it has not varied a lot. So if we want to have an G minus R to be positive, or interest minus growth to be negative, it is the growth that we should focus upon. Therefore, it is the higher growth that provides the key to the sustainability of debt for India. Are you people able to understand everything? Okay. Now, this is not something which we have found only in case of India. Economic Survey of India has found above pattern valid even after across the country analysis. That is, variability of IRGD primarily depends on variation in G. Even for other countries, interest rate variation is not that much. It is the growth rate variation that becomes important. Therefore, the dynamics of debt sustainability should be analyzed separately for high growth economies from that of low growth economies. That is, high growth economies, उनके लिए fiscally sustainable होना would be something else, because their growth rate is high when compared to low growth economies. Now come to, in India, growth leads to debt sustainability and not vice versa. Please understand this. Here we are trying to prove you that higher growth will lead to debt sustainability rather than higher debt or higher debt today leading to better growth tomorrow. Or what we are trying to say is, if you reduce the growth today, it will not, if you reduce the debt today, it will not lead to better growth tomorrow. What you have to focus upon is better growth today. Okay, here we are saying this. Growth to debt in high growth emerging market economies. जहाँ पे higher growth है, वहाँ पे if we change the government debt to GDP, then what will be happening to growth rate next year? This is a study where we see that even if we reduce the debt to GDP ratio a lot, the real growth rate next year is not fixed or is not varying in a calculated manner according to it. But if you come here, you will see a pattern. If you increase the real growth rate today, in future you will see that debt to GDP ratio is decreasing. With increase in real growth rate, with increasing growth rate, debt to GDP ratio is decreasing. Debt in future will decrease. But today, if you decrease the debt, today you say that I do not want to take a lot of loan, so that in future I'll not have to pay back a lot and my GDP will increase. That is not shown here. The data does not show it. Whereas what it shows is, if you focus on growth with more growth, next year you will find your debt to GDP ratio coming down. There's a pattern available, rough correlation available here. This correlation is absent here. Okay, now This evidence is not only coming from India, this evidence is coming from all over the world, from emerging market economies, जहां पे growth rate ज्यादा है, जिन countries में growth rate ज्यादा है, where this has been proved. These findings are also buttressed by evidence of this causal relation for all high growth emerging market economies put together. This is the data for all high growth emerging market economies. Now, would higher government spending lead to crowding out of private investment? Agar government, after taking a lot of debt, invest a lot, will it prevent private investors from investing? See, in advanced economies, this is the case. In general, investment options are less. When government starts investing a lot, private players are crowded out. And thus, overall impact on GDP is not that much of government's investment in advanced economies. Moreover, there's one more reason, which is called Ricardian equivalence proposition. This Ricardian equivalence proposition basically says that if a person looks, okay, government is investing a lot today, then in future it will increase the tax rate because to take care of this debt which government has borne. So in future I'll have to pay more tax. Let me save money for paying more tax. This is Ricardian equivalence proposition. For these two reasons, we say that when government is spending a lot of money, private players are crowded out, private investment is crowded out. One, they are not finding scope to invest. Two, a rational person would think, okay, government is spending a lot of money, it is creating a lot of debt, it will have to pay a lot of interest in future, it will increase taxes in future. So I'll have to pay higher taxes there. So I should not invest anything here. But this is not valid for developing countries, where there are a lot of unemployed resources. What is meant by a lot of unemployed resources? See, today, India needs a lot of investment. If government increases its investment, it does not mean that private sector will not have a scope to invest. India has a lot of unemployed resources. We do not have good quality roads. If government invests a lot in national infrastructure pipeline and improve the quality of roads, private sector will come and invest in industries. We are not advanced economies. We are developing ones. We have lot of unused resources, underused resources. And thus, the crowding out may not occur here. Rather than that, government's investment will add the multiplier effect, will increase private investment and can actually be beneficial. Okay, now come to so this is what we are concluding here. Several studies, including the one by Economic Survey of India 2020-21, is saying in an economy below full capacity, India is an economy below full capacity, the supply of savings may grow from greater government spending through demand creation and thereby greater employment. Economic Survey of India's analysis of the relationship between changes in public investment and changes in private investment for the period 1991-2019 also finds this correlation to be insignificant. That is what we are saying is, in India, गवर्नमेंट का एक्सपेंडिचर और प्राइवेट एक्सपेंडिचर में कोरिलेशन इज नॉट देयर. ऐसा नहीं है कि इफ गवर्नमेंट्स इन्वेस्टमेंट इंक्रीजेस प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट इज गोइंग डाउन. फ्रॉम 1991 to 2019 this has been seen. So increased government expenditure will not crowd out private investment. This is what we are, Economic Survey of India is concluding based on India's research as well as from other countries' data. Now, how does India, like we are talking about increasing India's debt today to invest more, right? How does India's debt look like right now? Right now, India's overall debt as a percentage of our GDP is one of the lowest among G20 countries, G20 mein especially the OECD countries as well as BRICS countries. Our debt is not very high. That's what we are trying to say. So increase in debt is possible. Second, our external debt is only 2.7% of our GDP. And thus, foreign exchange risk is also very low. If the volatility occurs in foreign exchange rate, because our foreign loans are very less, we are not at that much risk. Then of all the government debt that we have, 70% is by central government. Now 70% debt is by central government and the responsibility of economic management primarily is with central government. So this is also a desirable thing. Then India's loans have long maturity profile. That is, most of India's loan is something that has to be returned back in 5 years or 6 years or 10 years. It's not something that has to be returned next year. So when we are taking a lot of loan today, it doesn't have to be returned tomorrow only or next year only. So we'll have time to use that money to lead to economic growth and thus pay back the loan. And finally, one more thing, of all the central government debt, only 6% is external, rest of it is internal. And of all the debt that we have, only 2.7% is external. Okay, so that's why our India's debt profile is also saying that loan, we are in a good situation. So finally, what do we say? We're saying that our IRGD, that is interest rate growth differential, has remained negative and is expected to remain negative in the coming years too. Because even if we go by data from IMF, World Bank, India's economic growth rate is going to be 4, 5, 6%, 7%, something like this. It is varying. But our interest rate, our inflation will be controlled by monetary policy of RBI. RBI's monetary policy is focusing on consumer price index. It is expected to remain around 4%. So even in coming future, our IRGD is expected to be negative. Our growth is expected to be more than the interest rate. And therefore, going for economic growth is something that we should focus upon, and that is what we are talking about in our conclusion, that during COVID-19, India has done a lot of structural reforms. Under Atmanirbhar Bharat 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, we have gone for a lot of structural reforms. Mining sector has been reformed, agriculture sector has been reformed, industry sector has been reformed, MSME sector has been reformed, labor laws has been, a lot of structural reforms have come. But those will give benefits in medium term and long term. Their benefits would not be visible today. But we have to sustain our economy today to ensure that we are able to get those benefits. We have to create what is known as economic bridge, and that can be created by a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which is possible for us. This counter-cyclical fiscal policy, an expansionary policy, in recessionary period this will be an expansionary policy, can be very much beneficial for long term if we properly plan it. If we boost potential growth with multi-year public investment packages, that is long-term investment kare agar government, it will be beneficial. And secondly, this long-term infrastructure can also prevent India from falling into middle income trap. So middle income trap is basically what has happened is, initially when a country is underdeveloped and becomes developing, its growth rate becomes very high. But there are very few countries which have moved from developing countries to developed country category. Very few countries have been able to do it. Most of the countries who move from underdeveloped to developing stage, their per capita income remains below $12,000 per year. That is underdeveloped developing wale stage mein. They are not able to cross. For example, Turkey is an example. Russia is an example. These countries have not been able to grow beyond that middle income trap, and that has mostly happened because of infrastructure. So if today, when we are planning for expansionary economic policy and we focus on better infrastructure, we may even be able to prevent ourselves from falling into this middle income trap or low wage trap. So basically we are saying government should spend more. We have feasibility, but at the same time Economic Survey of India is saying that we are not saying that government should be spending irresponsibly. We are just giving them an intellectual backing that spending more is not an issue. If your growth is higher than your interest rate, then your debt would remain sustainable. You should spend more. But irresponsibly spend nahi karna hai, uske bare mein hum baat nahi kar rahe hain. Okay, so with this, we're done with this chapter. It's again a 40-page chapter in Economic Survey of India. The notes we have provided you is in 7 or 8 pages. You do not need to study anything beyond it. If you want to go and read Economic Survey of India, you read it, but you will not find anything relevant worth adding in your notes. I have myself gone through that chapter 4 or 5 times at least, to ensure that I'm able to explain you things in a systematic manner, in a manner which is easily understood, as well as in a manner which does not leave anything important behind. Okay, then like last time we also have two questions. Like in last time's video, none of you have written an answer yet. On YouTube we put a video, I think yesterday or day before yesterday. You haven't written an answer. Try to spare some time. Prelims is still thoda dur. So in that period, try to write one or two answers. If you'll write these answers, no, your understanding of these chapters of Economic Survey of India will improve a lot. Okay, so with this, I'm ending this class here. Tomorrow, I'll come with Economic Survey of India, Chapter 3. Thank you.